In the mid-16th century, a mystic named John wrote a beautiful poem about the soul's union with the divine. He didn't actually title his work, but it has come down to us as La Noche Oscura del Alma, the dark night of the soul. And although this poem describes a metaphysical journey of the soul that isn't actually negative, but deep and intense, the expression the dark night of the soul is popularly used to this day to describe a crisis of faith or meaning. In other words, a really hard and painful time. People use that term, dark night of the soul, to describe periods of depression, times of immobilizing grief, times of being unable to function. Autobiographies of religious people use the term dark night of the soul to describe times when their faith was non-existent, when they felt abandoned by God or just bereft. But listen to what Juan actually writes. The soul makes greater progress when it travels in the dark, not knowing the way. God himself is here, the guide of the soul in its blindness, and therefore the soul may well exult and say, in darkness and in safety, now that it has come to a knowledge of its state. It's a lot, but just the takeaway for me is darkness as a realm of safety. How beautiful. John also says that divine wisdom is so high that it transcends the capacity of the soul, and therefore is, in that respect, also of darkness. In other words, darkness is mystery. It is divine wisdom. Both are such lovely interpretations of the possibilities of darkness. So much more than just suffering and pain that has come to be synonymous with that expression, dark night of the soul, which I think discredits or diminishes John's contribution, although it's quite understandable. It makes sense that people who lived before the discovery of electricity would have mostly negative connotations of darkness. When the sun set and darkness fell, humans have long been much more vulnerable. Way back to our origins, living outdoors or in caves, huddled around a fire, keeping watch for big animal predators, it's natural for the human to have fear of the dark. That lives in our brain somewhere. Some people sleep with a nightlight on today because something either in their brains or perhaps in their past experience signals to them that they're in danger when it's dark. Well, we've had access to artificial light now for about 140 years, but old associations and symbols don't evolve that quickly. We still use the terms black and dark to signify bad, evil, or negation. Advent, Hanukkah, and the solstice are all festivals and holy seasons that use the imagery of light triumphing over the darkness. It is said in churches and synagogues at this time of year that we light candles against the darkness of ignorance, oppression, hatred, the darkness of a world where the holy has been ignored or is in exile. As people who seek spiritual growth and maturity, I encourage us to challenge this inherited binary concept of darkness as bad and light as good, and to reflect more deeply on that binary when we hear it before we reflexively repeat it. Any kind of strict either or thinking is likely to miss a lot of nuance and a lot of wisdom. That's the first reason to more carefully consider our instant assumption that something called the dark night of the soul must be painful and bad and to be avoided, which is actually the opposite of what John of the Cross wrote. He said, in fact, that the soul makes more progress in the darkness than otherwise. A second reason is that the equating of darkness and blackness with ignorance and evil reinforces racism. I remember our lecturer, Reverend Tandeyaka, who came to work with us on an anti-racism weekend, bringing up this point, and I'm also indebted to the Advent reflections of the womanist theologian, Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney of Bright Divinity School, who often makes the same point in her writings. The metaphors we use matter. Language matters. Centuries of symbolism equating light with virtue and preaching that the light must conquer the darkness have had terrible implications. We have to be willing to dig down into where the meanings lie and live within us, to examine what we have inherited. And that's a big one. I hate the short days. I suffer, as many of you do, with the lack of sunlight. I just bought myself one of those light therapy thingies for the first time. I've been saying for years I was going to get one, but I finally just ordered one. I'm going to sit in front of it for 30 minutes a day. As we begin a second winter of COVID cautiousness, still deprived of many of the twinkling, shining festivals that bring us joy and a sense of magic to this season, I am certainly not going to minimize the difficulty of the darkness. Sun deprivation is a fact in our hemisphere this time of year. But there can be plenty of sunlight, even on cold, short days as well. And we know, most of us, that that does us good to get out into it. It was no accident that when Christianity was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, the day of Christ's birth was chosen to be the day that had previously been celebrated as the birth of Mithras, the sun god, whose cult had immediately preceded the new religion. The Emperor Constantine had been a devotee of Mithras before he converted to Christianity, and the proximity of both of those figures' natal days to the winter solstice is symbolically important. Both Jesus Christ and Mithras were light bringers to a world said to be shrouded in darkness. But because darkness can be gentle, rich, and generative, we need not use it so exclusively as a metaphor for an interior struggle, especially when there are so many other metaphors from the natural world to describe spiritual emptiness or intellectual ignorance. Here are just a few I came up with this week. How about dryness, rockiness, frozenness, gnarled, choked, the way that a bittersweet winds itself so beautifully around a living tree, warping and strangling it. When we are thrust into depression, is it actually darkness we are experiencing, or are there other qualities to that bleakness? Flatness, for instance, comes to mind. Monochromatic dullness, crushing heaviness or torpor. When we consider the vastness of our language and work harder to describe our experiences, darkness and blackness can be appropriately liberated from the problematic and limiting usage that we're accustomed to. This is not just helpful, but correct. Because darkness is not just a lack of light. It's not just a negative. It is its own metaphysical reality. Mystery. Unknowingness. Flip the script for a moment. What if we occasionally said, wishing you the darkness of the season, or wishing you love and darkness, instead of the customary love and light, blessing? What would we be transmitting with those wishes? What would we be liberating? For one thing, we'd be liberating ourselves from what is being called toxic positivity in pop psychology. I see someone nodding vigorously. It's a term that I appreciate and have begun to use. Toxic positivity is just what it sounds like, the insistence on smiling, putting on a positive outlook. And it leads to some really cheap theological claims, like God never gives you more than you can handle. Okay, let's stop and look at that thing for a minute. Okay, it's really, people say it a lot. In my generous interpretation of that expression, I take it to mean that, life is full of twists and turns, and that being human, we're designed to cope with all of them, and also naturally inclined to help each other get through them. But in my less generous interpretation, when I hear that phrase just tossed out there, I take it to mean, I don't have the time or the inner discipline to just be with you in a supportive, companionable silence in your suffering. So let me throw a cliche at you. The casual claim that God is a kind of small office manager who somehow gives people things to deal with is also really problematic. It's much better to just show up for each other. Again, even in silent solidarity, just to listen. Toxic positivity is also obsessed with light, sometimes to the extent that harms those whose hearts and souls would benefit from dwelling in a time of gentle, enveloping darkness, mystery, and unknowing. Nothing in nature blooms all the time. But toxic positivity suggests that that's so, and that we should make that our goal. The Enlightenment of the 18th century, with its new emphasis on rational scientific knowledge, perpetuated an unrealistic notion that human beings can eventually know everything, fix everything, and solve all things through scientific advancement. And we, Unitarians and Universalists, are both heirs of that time, of that moment. Some religious movements that arose during the Enlightenment have to caution ourselves about our own tendency to claim to know it all. Allowing ourselves to rest in darkness can instruct us in awe and humility. Dark. It can right-size our egos and readjust our assumptions about the limits of knowledge, of scientific knowledge. What would we mean if we said, I wish you darkness, dear friend? We might mean, I wish you a sense of comfort, abiding in mystery. I wish you to feel held and encompassed by a great love as you experience this time of not being in control. The darkness shimmers. It is alive. It communicates deep, deep things. But we cannot receive those things when we encounter darkness, we scramble immediately to turn on the lights, to grasp for information and control. That is an illusion. when we demonize the darkness and conceptualize light as a weapon against it. We await the birth of the light in this season, yes. But where we are is in the womb of what the poet Greta Crosby calls pregnant negativity, a beautiful darkness. In the darkness of the womb is where we all began this journey. It is our original home. And there is still a home for us there in the holy darkness, in the womb of creation, where we are safe, where we can rest in unknowing, where we are being nurtured, and where we can grow. Blessings of the darkness, my friends.